Hello, friends and neighbors. I'm going to talk about Ireland today. And a few videos back, I started talking about how Christianity came into different countries. And um, sometimes, in order to convert the pagans um, and multi-god worshippers that lived in different areas, they used some of their traditions to teach them about Jesus and God. And so, like for example, we have the what's called the Celtic cross that has the regular cross, of course, and then the circle around there. And the circle is very prominent in a lot of the Celtic art and the Celtic story. It's the circle of life. Celts didn't see life as a straight line, as sometimes we do in the Western world, and it it was woven in to their tapestries and carved into stones, and then I also said, well, these were burial monuments, headstones, so to speak, in graveyards. And so some of these are 6, 7, 8, 10 feet tall. They're quite beautiful. Sometimes they have this kind of braidwork that was also used in the illuminated texts. And I have some examples of those as well. So here is a detail from the Book of Kells. The Book of Kells was an Irish illuminated Bible. These were, of course, kept in monasteries. And here's another, the Book of Kells, Kells. That's one of the places it was kept safe from Viking raiders in Ireland. And of course, that is a depiction of angels looking over Mother Mary with baby Jesus. See? And it would have been decorated around here with gold, filigree, and really expensive inks that were made out of crushed gemstones sometimes, and a lot of natural plants and stuff. But it sort of taught to people who couldn't read the stories just by looking at the pictures. And you can see that just like on those high crosses, on those Celtic crosses, that some of that braid work is around that. So let's see if you can catch some of the gold colors that are in there. It's amazingly detailed. You think they're working with candlelight, maybe lanterns, with quills and wooden styluses to put the inks on. And then it was written as well. The Bible was written out, and these decorated around the either pages or around the written. You're not going to be able to see that very well, but they decorated all through there. It took a lot of time to translate like a fading Bible into a new Bible. So this Book of Kells was probably made in the 500s or the 600s, and during an AD. That period of time, a lot of the monasteries on islands like Iona off the western coast were they were flourishing, and Christianity was being exported from Ireland into Europe, which was in the Dark Ages after the Roman collapse. A lot of places were slipping sort of back into a Christian pagan kind of combo. Christianity wasn't always as well defined in some of Europe as in Ireland. And even though that was one of the last places that it came to originally in the 300s, in the 200s, 300s. But anyway, so they would send monks into Europe, and this illumination of the Bibles was something that came back and forth. So that is part of how the combination came. So like the shamrocks, and they aren't clovers. I've been friends with some people from Ireland. They stress that it's not a four-leaf clover. It is a shamrock. And here is just a towel that's been printed with it. And see the shamrock. It looks a little bit like clover, but it's not clover. It's a different plant entirely, and it's been a sacred plant in Ireland into the ancient Celt days. Now, the ancient Celts, they were horsemen. They were a cattle culture, and crops. Yeah, they had some crops, mostly to feed their cattle and to make probably drinks, ales and beers and things like that, mead. So maybe whiskey, probably whiskey, knowing the Celts. But so they had the shamrock and the green. Ireland is very green. I was fortunate enough to go to Ireland for 2 weeks in 1997, and even in October it was lush and green. Now there's quite a bit of rain there, but the people, the Celts, they were famous for their cattle and their horses, and we'll go more into that. Their music, their dance, their poetry, harp. The harp is a national instrument, even though now they're more known as fiddle music. The harp has long been, like in the ancient Celt times, the harpists, the bards, they were some of the highest members of the Celtic society. And so they have blessings. They're known for the Irish blessings. Here's one with the bird, the wildlife, the bird, and I am not lucky, I am blessed. And you see that there's the shamrock incorporated right into that. So there's lots of things like that. I'm going to read a poem I wrote a couple years ago, around a little bit before St. Patrick's Day, called Irish Roots. I actually have it framed, and a little bit decorated. I have based on the Book of Kells, I do a cross. It's supposed to represent a ribbon that's been folded in on itself to make that cross. It's a stylized thing that I've made. It's called Irish Roots. The Irish roots run deep. Hand of God, hand of love, tin whistles, harps and drums, stirring deep from above. The brightest green of grass, dipped in gold, dipped for you. The heart starts beating fast. Soon it shall be renewed. I wrote that a couple years ago. I tried to capture some of the Celtic style of poetry. Now, we've got a map here. This is a map of Ireland, and it's all the different counties. And basically, in the ancient times of the Celts, there was 4 provinces, which was basically chop the top off, and that's all of what's Northern Ireland now, part of Great Britain. Over this way would have been, get that right, kind of where I stayed. I stayed in Clifton, which is in County Galway. Back then, this was the province of Connacht. It's Connemara now in that area. This would have been the southern province, I think, was Munster. The northern province was Ulster. And over here was Leinster? Hey, if you're from Ireland, you're going to cut me some slack here. I'm from Maine, in the United States. But anyway, and that's mainly where Dublin is, over that way. So you can see there's a lot of different counties. And in the ancient times, they actually, these counties were roughly different tribal areas. So there's, there's quite a bit in a fairly small, I mean, it's only small compared to, like the way we think about the United States. It's small, but it's a big island. It's a big island, So there's lots of different kinds of people there, is what I was going to get at with that. And of course, the history of Ireland is pretty interesting. They were Celts that settled there, but there were people there before the Celts settled there, and of course they had to conquer them, and that's prehistoric. There's only verbal traditions. The Druids were the priests, and there's a lot of differences of opinion about these Druids, the priests, the teachers, the keepers of the sacred lore. They taught about the tribes. They taught about the gods. And a part of why there was this amalgam of the ancient Celts and the Christian converts, a lot of the first Irish priests had been Druids. And when St. Patrick was teaching them about Jesus, and there's a lot of silver in Ireland, and there's a silver coin I have that my mom gave me. And then there's St. Patrick on the, there he is, he's teaching the Celts and converting Ireland. There's that cross again. And what's on the back? This would be a depiction of Ireland. The Emerald Isle is also called Eire, E-I-R-E, or maybe Eire. It's a beautiful place. There's an interesting thing that I think goes way back. they call it Ireland of the welcomes. And when you meet a person for the first time, especially the older folks, but younger people said it too. You introduce yourselves and, hey, I'm Andrew, and I'm visiting, trying to figure out where my mom's family comes from. She had Irish in her. Anyway, they'll say, oh, you're welcome. And to an American, that seems funny because you only say you're welcome if somebody says thank you. And they'll say, oh, you're welcome as soon as you've introduced yourself. And it's kind of confusing at first till you realize they're saying, well, you're welcome to their country. You're welcome to their town. You're welcome to their home. They're very welcoming. I think that is a Celtic trait. People all over the world are like that, but it is very pronounced. So, yes, there's a lot of poetry there. There's a lot of music. There's a tin whistle. Tin whistle is how most children in Ireland learn music, and they learn it rather early on. And I'll see if I can play a little something for you. So, and most of the kids, by the time they're 8 years old, can play it better than me. I like to go hiking, and this fits right into the side pocket of one of my backpack. So this always goes hiking with me, along with my harmonica, which I don't think is particularly Irish, so let's not get there for now. But I do have one other very particularly Irish instrument, and I'll show you. And I am just teaching myself how to play it a little tiny bit. So this is a Celtic harp, and it's decorated with some of the braid work. It's also been carved into the chamber part, carved with some plants, which is appropriate. And it's called a lap harp because it's not the full-size floor kind of a harp. Oh, and also one other thing. Notice my sweater. This also has that braid work, so it gets worked in. This is called Aran, A-R-A-N, Aran Island, which is right off the coast of County Galway. There's actually several of them there. They're mostly still Irish speakers. Most of Ireland, is English as their first language, but the western part tends to be more of where the Gaelic or the Celtic is still spoken. And the modern form of Celtic is Irish, the Irish. And in that part of Ireland, they actually, especially more of the older folks, they speak it as their first language. English is their second language. But there's been a renaissance of sorts, an Irish renaissance, which all the kids are learning Irish again. But it's mostly as a second language, at least for now. You never know how these things go. But since English, is used so much in the world of business especially, they'll probably keep using English as their first language. But it's good to know your roots. So there's your harp. And if you can imagine, about this size, probably had a special bag to put it in, and the bards would sling it over their shoulder and travel from different villages, different farmsteads. As in most ancient times, they didn't have cities in Ireland. Then later on, 700s, 800s, the Vikings started settling on the coast, and they started forming towns because they were tradesmen, and the Irish mostly had farmsteads, homesteads with small plots with their animals. And then their wealth were based on how much cattle they had, how many cattle they had, how many cows they had, how many bulls they had, and all that. And there's tons of ancient Celtic stories about cattle raids, and the biggest heroes were a lot of times people that would raid and get a famous bull, and they'd come back with it and take it for their own, which of course, wherever they got it from, had to come try to get it back. So this goes back and forth all through the Celtic history in Ireland. And so there's art, music. Oh, there's folk tales, storytelling. That's very, very important. As, let's say, it probably came from the histories. There's the Connemara ponies, or what their horses are called. They have turf races, or dirt horse tracks, where they race these Connemara ponies, and it goes way back in their history, of course, as well as the cattle raising. So the bard would tell entertaining, funny stories. He would tell stories about the chieftains of that particular province, or the kings, or different people where he was staying. He would entertain them, and then they would give him the choice cuts out of the pot for supper, and furs and jewels, and depending how good of a storyteller he was. And also, these stories were relating the history of the tribes and the clans. So that it was pre-written. They memorized all their stories. And it could take 20 years to become a bard, to memorize the histories properly. And so you see that it is still very important to the Irish to have music and dance. And there's a pretty fascinating history there of why is the shamrock so important? Why is that Celtic cross with the circle in it? It's because some of the old traditions got carried through for the for all those people to be converted, stop worshiping the old demons, and start worshiping God. And Ireland actually got converted relatively quick compared to a lot of countries. And they think maybe because St. Patrick was very powerful in the way that he presented the Lord, but also because the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, you see, has a lot to do with some of the old Celtic gods and their relation to each other. So it just made sense in their minds, and they tried to beat Patrick with their gods, and the Lord just did some miracles and didn't allow their druids couldn't best them in the priests and all in their different contests. And after the druids realized, whoa, this god is powerful, our gods aren't cutting it, and they started converting and becoming priests for Jesus, then they also, when they were writing down, like in the Book of Kells, and their ancestors would be writing some of those down, they also kept alive a lot of the Irish folk tales. So we have them now because the Christians had a written language. So that was kind of a lucky thing as far as historians and studying the history. We learn, you learn a lot about people by studying their history. You see, how did people deal with like a primitive, well, no electricity, how we take these things for granted, but it wasn't that long ago that we didn't have electricity. And, a lot of people still don't have electricity, but in the world, that's changing pretty fast. So you can see that things in a lot of ways aren't that different. People themselves, they really haven't changed that much when you start realizing that the things they had to overcome back then sometimes were a lot harder than what we have to deal with now. There was a lot of people lived a lot closer to starvation in some of the times of the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages than we generally do now, at least in the Western world. And so yeah, these are handmade wool. Of course, because there's so much green, beautiful grass, very rich, sheep prosper in the western part of Ireland, at least. I mean, that's the only part I've been to, so I don't know too much about the rest of it. And that's so that we can the tradition of that cable work. Different families had a different cable. Different families, and when they went out fishing, because these were island folk, when they'd go out fishing, if they supposedly this is why they had these different intricate cable works. It represented the nets. You can see it's like the nets of the fishing nets. But if a fishing net went down in a storm and people were drowned, if they, got washed up on shore a week later, they'd be in a pretty poor state. They could tell who was who by these sweaters and the cable work signifying the different families. That's one story I've heard. It kind of makes sense. Now, they're just things of beauty and warm. I live in northern Maine, so wool is always popular in cold weather. anyway, the Irish are an interesting study. And if you ever want to know about some of the old Celtic ways, there's a writer named John O'Donoghue, O'Donohue. He wrote the Anam Cara, which is a book of Celtic wisdom, and he writes poetry. He's passed on now, but he's a more modern writer. I actually almost got to meet him, but it didn't quite work out, because he used to like to go, when I was in Ireland, I wanted to find some of the standing stones. Oh, I don't have any pictures of them. Hang on. So some of these stone rings, like Stonehenge in England, and there's some like that in Ireland. These could have predated the Celts. But then there was megalithic tombs and other burial tombs. And I went out in the bogs of Shanahever. There's one that a nice girl brought me out to see. And this is like just two stones. It's also called a dolmen. And you get two stones. That and this big capstone. And there's ideas of what this was. Some people think the Druids used it to worship. Other people think that it was actually a burial tomb and the body would have been put in here. And this was all eroded over time, because this could be thousands of years old. Nobody knows for sure. And so that's a burial tomb, perhaps, megalithic tomb, or it could have been some kind of a worship thing. Could have been a combined. They could have had, ancestor worship. Pretty likely, especially in the old times. If that was a famous person, they might have worshipped it, even if it was a burial spot. So it could be a little of this and a little of that. And we'll probably never know. Like I said, they didn't write down their histories. And then by the time they got written down, the stories were, some of the things were probably left out or changed, because now they're Christianized Druids, ex-Druids, so to speak. And they wouldn't want, some of their old ways would then be considered of the devil, as they're born again people. And they wouldn't want to not only didn't they want to make much out of the old pagan things, but they also a lot of times attacked the old ways for being wrong. So they, it could have gone pretty far over the other side as far as just attacking the ancient ways. And, maybe for good reason, if it's like child sacrifice or something, which I'm not saying was something that was in Ireland, or I don't know. There's different stories about the history of the Celts, and it's hard to get into that, because like the Druids, just the Druids, for a quick example, and I'm not going to get into a whole history lesson, but there's the Druids who really were, which we may never exactly know. There's the Druids as we wish they might have been, which is like the modern so-called Druids that go and walk around Stonehenge every year at the summer solstice in the winter. And they may or may not be even slightly close to to what the real ones were. That's kind of like a dreamy, what we wish they would have been. And then also you have Julius Caesar, who definitely laid it on thick about the Druids in Gaul, so that he could get Romans behind him, and he said all kinds of horrible things about them that probably wasn't that true either. So that he could go and attack them and conquer them. So there's those three things. Oh, and then the Druids that really were the Druids as we might dreamily pretend they were, and also what we want to say they were because we want to say they were so wrong that we hate them. So there's these three different ways, and you can get a book. You can get a book like this. This is pretty fair. Stuart Pigou, The Druids. This one sort of tries to go into all of those aspects. They try to get to what the real Druids were with archaeology, but like I said, some of those stone structures, like Stonehenge, actually, there's stories about the Celts saying, we don't know who made those. So it might have been way before they got there, is what I'm saying. And that's what happens when you get into ancient history. Especially societies that didn't write it down. The native tribes in North America were like that. The Celts were like that. A lot of tribes were like that. They wrote some of their history in picture. Like the different tribes of North America. A lot of them wrote picture histories, and that's what the Celts did too. So there was a language starting. It was called Ogham. It was starting, but it's probably because they had already run into other people like Romans and Romanized English that were starting to use a language, and so the Irish would cut grooves into wood, but a lot of those were just considered part of Satan, and they were just destroyed. So there's very few of those left, and it was wood. So you're talking wood over 1,000 years or 2,000 years. Doesn't always hold up very well either, unless you really take special care of it. So, of course, they also, that same Ogham that they wrote into the wood is in some stones. So they have been able to figure out some of that. That was later, though. That was later in Celtic history, but it still helps to try to figure it out. So anyway, that's how the circle got under the cross, as far as I can tell. And you probably don't know this, but I love history. You probably figured it out. And I started studying the Vikings when I was just a teenager. And then, because I have Swedish ancestry. And then, because of the Irish, well, the Vikings conquered a lot of the coasts of Ireland. And so then I started studying the Irish history. And you should know where, if your ancestors came from a certain land, it makes sense to me to understand the history of that land. I'm American. I love America, and I love the history of America as well. But there's certain traits, even in America, that's based on British law, and some of the British law actually is formed from the Celtic law, some of the concepts of it. And some of the attitudes of it. The Celts were rather romantic, boisterous, bragging, loving music, musical, poetic. You can't be all those things and then just come to the New World and just get rid of all of them. Although the great spaces of the New World, just the freedom, the raw freedom that they got when they came here, did change the people. And they came from being a lot of times servants in the old world and just became in charge of their own destiny. They brought their beliefs about God with them. Some of them left that behind too. But most of them brought God in their hearts with them. And so anyway, that's my little bit about Ireland. I hope you liked it, and drop me a message if you know anything about the Irish that I forgot to mention. I didn't get into the drinking because that's sort of a thing that goes with dancing and music and is also a stereotype. And stereotypes are generally based on some truth and some foolishness. So I'm not going to get into that stuff. And let's just say, if you live life, you probably experience all kinds of things. And I think God, wants us to do that responsibly most of the time. But you don't want to be walled in to this little tiny box and never go and take a chance and experience life. So the Irish definitely knew how to do that. Thanks so much, you guys, for watching this. I love you guys, and this is an amazing time to be alive. And if you don't know where you came from, you don't know where you're going. So God bless you, protect you, keep you strong. Give me a thumbs up if you like this. Subscribe to the channel, and put in any ideas that you have about something that I've mentioned that I haven't followed through on and gone more into detail, or that you'd like me to talk about. This has been great fun, and I never know what I'm going to tear off my wall to show you everybody. So, remember to be kind to each other and be loving, and give great thanks to God for all the blessings. You have a great day, and I'll talk to you next time.